On Tuesday, the 18th of January, 1887, an appalling disaster occurred at the Hebrew Dramatic Club situated at 3 Princes Street, Spitalfields. 17 people died in the tragedy, all of them, with one exception, women and young children. Princes Street is now called Princelet Street, and it is located between Hanbury Street and Fournier Street in the Brick Lane and Fournier Street conservation area. Number 3, where the calamity occurred, was demolished in the 1970s, and a modern rebuild of it now stands on its site. The background to the disaster begins with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II of Russia on Sunday the 13th of March, 1881. This triggered a series of pogroms, which, as they gathered momentum over the next few years, led to a mass exodus of Jews, many of whom fled to London, where a large percentage of them settled in the East End. Their common language was Yiddish, an amalgamation of German, Russian, Hebrew, and other dialects. On a bitterly cold December day in 1883, a boat carrying hundreds of Jewish refugees arrived in London. Amongst them was a small troupe of Yiddish actors led by Jacob Adler. Adler, whose nickname was the Great Eagle, Adler being the German for eagle, and his fellow performers had enjoyed great success in Odessa. But then, in August 1883, Yiddish Theatre was banned in Russia. Faced with the sudden loss of their livelihood, the troupe had eventually managed to travel to Hamburg on a cattle boat, paying for their passage by entertaining the crew en route. From Hamburg, they had then sailed to London. Adler was a distant relative of the chief rabbi of the British Empire, Dr. Nathan Marcus Adler, and he arrived in London with a letter of introduction that his father had written to the chief rabbi. Unfortunately, the chief rabbi was no fan of Yiddish theatre. He considered Yiddish to be nothing more than a jargon, and he refused to offer any assistance or support to his kinsman. Luckily, the troupe found that Yiddish theatre already existed in London, albeit the performers were enthusiastic amateurs as opposed to professional thespians. Plays were staged in private in what were referred to as club rooms, and performances were only permitted so long as they were given solely for club members and no admission was charged. Adler's troupe began performing at these club rooms, and they soon established themselves as the preeminent Yiddish theatre group in the East End, and the local Jewish community flocked to see them. A small paradise existed for us in the London theatre clubs of the 1880s, Adler later recalled. We played and played well, with a drunkenness of happiness. Fortune soon smiled on Jacob Adler and his fellow players. A Dorset Street butcher by the name of David Smith was greatly impressed when he saw them perform, and he became not only a fan of Adler's, but also a friend and a patron. In March 1886, Smith, having formed a committee to raise the necessary £3,000, built a theatre for Adler's company at No. 3 Princes Street in Spitalfields. Although the playhouse was constructed in the style of a London music hall, with a stage, an orchestra pit and a balcony, it actually operated as a private club, for which members paid a weekly subscription of 1 shilling, and its official name was the Princes Street Hebrew Dramatic Club. David Smith's son, Abraham, became the manager. His duties, he later explained, were to ensure that subscriptions were paid, that no bad language was used, and that audiences were properly seated. The club catered almost exclusively to the neighbourhood's Jewish community, and although it boasted a reading room, a bar, and a games room, it was the plays that the enthusiastic audiences came to see. Indeed, such was the demand that the actors put on performances every night of the week, except for Fridays. In his 1892 novel, Children of the Ghetto, a study of a peculiar people, Israel Zangwill, who refers to Yiddish as the jargon, has one character ask another where a comedy is to be played. "At the Jargon Theatre, the great theatre in Princes Street," comes the reply. "The only real national theatre in England. The English stage, Drury Lane, pooh! It is not in harmony with the people. It does not express them." According to Abraham Smith, he had had problems with a rival theatre manager by the name of Marx Rubenstein, who had, he said, sent round a gang of roughs to do all the mischief they could. Rubinstein, so Smith claimed, had threatened to set light to the place. As a result of these threats, Smith had taken the precaution of hiring a constable to ensure that nothing untoward befell the club. He did, however, admit that the threats hadn't actually been carried out, and they were probably nothing more than idle threats. On Tuesday, the 18th of January, 1887, Adler's troupe were enlisted to perform a benefit for a member of the local community who had fallen on hard times. The play to be performed was The Spanish Gipsy Girl, which, according to the Morning Post, was a favourite melodrama with the frequenters of the club, and it was, the paper informed its readers, given in the Hebrew tongue. The doors opened at 7 p.m, and the audience began filing in. To the right of the entrance, Reynolds's newspaper reported, there is an anteroom. Then a broadish passage leading straight into the body of the hall. Just at the entrance to the hall to the right is a staircase leading up to the balcony or gallery, the audience separating at this point on entering or converging on coming out. Every member of the audience would have passed this spot, little realizing how deadly its layout would prove just a few hours later. Nearly all those present were of the lower class of Jews, the Morning Post continued. Workers in the slop-making establishments, the boot trade, and other industries in which cheap labour is employed. And they were for the most part immigrants from Germany, Polish Prussia, and a part of Russia. The women were all dressed in holiday attire with gaily coloured costumes and a profusion of jewellery. By curtain up at 8 o'clock, a capacity audience filled the theatre. The management said there were around 400 people present. Some put the number at around 500, whilst others claimed that the number of attendees was closer to 800. According to an unnamed witness quoted by Lloyd's weekly newspaper, the hall was fairly full, and the performance, which was of an amusing character, gave great satisfaction, everyone being pleased and in high enjoyment, everything going on as well as could be desired. William Cohen, a weaver of 85 Brick Lane, was seated in the main hall with his wife and 2 children. Everything went smoothly up to the last act, he later told a journalist from Reynolds's weekly newspaper, and 5 minutes after that had commenced, I heard the sounds of a disturbance in the gallery. I thought at first it was only a fight, but presently I heard a cry that gas was escaping. Abraham Marks, a tailor of Booth Street Buildings, was standing with his back to the gallery wall, watching the stage, when he felt something hit him on the shoulder. Looking up, he saw that it was a gas pipe. A man was standing over him, holding the pipe. The pipe was only bent when he first looked up, but the man pushed it back into position, and it broke off by the tap, and gas began to escape. The mishap was witnessed by Maurice Gilberg of 3 Chicksand Street, who was watching the play from the gallery with his wife and their 3 sons, Harry, Daniel and Isaac. I saw a man, in attempting to get to his seat in the gallery, catch hold of a gas pipe, which broke in his hand, he told the Inquest. I ran up to it and threw my handkerchief over the broken end to prevent the gas from getting out. At this stage all was calm, but then someone shouted out that gas was escaping and there was going to be an explosion. This was followed by a cry of "Fire!" The cry of fire sounded like a boy or a woman and certainly came from the gallery, William Cohen told the Morning Post. The effect was startling. A fearful panic was created. Everyone rushed towards the doors. The actors tried to calm the audience. "Go back to your seats," Adler shouted from the stage. "There is no fire. There is no danger. Nothing has happened." He signalled the orchestra. The musicians began to play, and the actors started singing. For a moment the panic eased as the audience turned towards the stage. But then the lights went out, plunging the theatre into sudden darkness. An absolute pandemonium broke out as the panic-stricken audience from both the hall and the gallery, en masse, made a rush for the exit. The confusion and alarm was intensified, William Cohen recounted. The screams of the women and children were deafening and heart-rending. The shouts of the men added to the uproar. Everyone seemed to be fighting for dear life. It was impossible to see anything for a few minutes, which seemed more like an hour. No one seemed to know what to do. We were all packed in like herrings. I heard my little girl, who was only 2 yards off, crying, "Father, Father, save me!" But I could not move. Men, women and children were fighting, screaming and cursing like maniacs. All means of getting out was stopped by the crush of people. According to Lloyd's weekly newspaper, this babble of sound continued for some seconds, during which the occupants of the body of the hall rushed in a mass to the door at the same time that those from the gallery came tearing down the stone steps for the same destination. A collision was the result, only 1 or 2 escaping from the forefront of the mass, and the remainder becoming immovably interlocked at the junction of the staircase and the hall entrances. Speedily, the whole height of the staircase became packed with struggling human beings who poured down the steps regardless of the fate of those who had fallen to the bottom, and a terrible scene ensued. The women, being weakest, were the first to go down before the pressure of the excited crowd, and after them the young children, unable to keep their feet, were pressed down. The unfortunate victims were literally trampled to death by those who fell on them, or essayed to gain safety by treading on their prostrate bodies. The breath was crushed out of all who were unfortunate enough to be nearest the floor, and not one of these, so far as can be ascertained, escaped alive. Maurice Gilberg and his sons Harry and Daniel were pressed against the wall of the gallery, Maurice and Harry sustaining severe leg injuries in the crush. Daniel, so the newspapers reported, managed to jump on the heads of the people and, running over them, managed to escape into the street. With the panic reaching fever pitch, a member of the orchestra watched helplessly from the stage as the carnage unfolded. Suddenly, the gas went out and almost the entire audience began shrieking and crying out in the greatest terror and alarm. I could not tell at first what had caused the uproar, for I did not hear any cry of fire, possibly because the sound of the instrument drowned the noise. In an instant, all, or nearly all, of the audience in the body of the theatre rose en masse and began to push and crush their way to the rear where the doors were. The cries of the women and children as they were being knocked down and trampled on will never leave my memory. The darkness of the place made the rush and the outcries seem more terrible to me than anyone but an eyewitness can imagine or describe. Jacob Adler, also watching from the stage, spotted a woman on the balcony throw her coat over the railing and then position herself to jump after it. "You will fall and be killed, devil take you!" he shouted. But the woman, ignoring his warning, jumped, and her screams of pain added to the turmoil. Police Constable Edward Sequen was on duty in Princes Street when, at 11:15, he saw 2 women coming out of the club. They were screaming in a foreign language. He ran across the road and entered the building, where he saw several people. He asked what was the matter, but got no answer. The hall was in complete darkness, with only a light inside the street door, he told the Inquest. I took my lamp from my belt, turned it on, and saw people lying on the ground, and others coming out of the body of the hall and down the stairs. I told them to keep back, saying there was nothing the matter, but they took no heed. So I returned to the street, blew my whistle, and sent to the police station for assistance. Other constables arrived and tried to enter by the front, but finding it impossible to do so, they entered by the side door. They got into the hall at the back of the people. "The first time I entered the building," Constable Sequien continued, "I could get no farther than the bottom of the stairs. Other constables managed to push their way inside the hall, where they had to get the people back and pick up those that were lying prostrate up to the bar. They made them go out by the yard exit. Some had to be removed by force, but some went quietly." Mr. E. Sharp, who lived directly opposite the theatre, was alerted to the fact that something was happening when he heard the blast of a policeman's whistle. Opening his front door, he saw the commotion opposite, and since his mother-in-law was at the performance, he rushed over the road. Several police constables ran up at the same time, the Evening Standard reported. When they got to the door, they found a whole mass of bodies piled one on the other, and the exit was completely blocked. To get in and render assistance, they had to climb over some of the bodies, and the first thing they did when they got inside was to break down the partition at the foot of the staircase. This relieved much of the pressure. Bodies rolled over and over, and then began the awful task of separating the dead from the living. The scene was indescribable. It was horrible in the extreme. The appearance of the bodies showed the awful, agonizing deaths of the victims, and their faces were so distorted as to be unrecognizable. He believed if the partition had not been broken down, the loss of life would have been trebled. Thankfully, his mother-in-law survived. The police had soon got the situation under control, and order was restored. Then began the grim task of clearing the mound of dead and injured. Lloyd's weekly newspaper provided a sombre account of the rescue mission. Once order had been restored, the work of freeing the trapped people still inside got under way. Those who showed the most signs of life being lifted rapidly out, and an attempt made to restore them, while the inanimate women and children, who all bore the evidence of having struggled violently for existence, were taken out and laid in an anteroom. All these were beyond the reach of restoratives, while those who escaped alive suffered little or no injury when able to breathe freely again. One by one, the victims were taken up from the floor of the passage and the gallery steps. The last of the victims removed was a little girl named Eva Marks, aged 9 years, who was found to be almost at the bottom of the heap of human bodies at the foot of the staircase, her clothes torn almost completely away. While near her was picked up Jacob Levy, who was 70 years old and who was the only man to die. He had apparently suffered a heart attack as he was assisting his wife to escape from the lower part of the hall. By him, his wife was also found, quite dead. The clothes of many of the women were torn and disarranged in the struggle, and hung in tatters on their lower limbs, their stockings being even torn, and the boots of several being half off. In total, 17 people died in the tragedy. 2 men living in the same house each lost his wife, neither of the husbands having been present at the club, and the circumstances of these cases were aggravated by the fact that each woman would shortly have become a mother. Both women were of the same age, 24 years. One of the most pathetic incidents in connection with the calamity was related to a reporter by one of those who assisted to clear the hall. When it was thought everybody had been removed, a baby was found under one of the seats in a very exhausted condition. After restoratives had been applied, the child recovered, and the only word she could pronounce was "Mama," and this she repeated, sobbing continuously. The little one's mother was found amongst the dead. Morris and Harry Gilberg were taken to the London hospital, where they were treated for the injuries to their legs. On returning home, Morris found no sign of Mrs. Gilberg and his third son, Isaac. Returning to the theatre, he discovered that they were among the dead. Over the coming days, as people attempted to come to terms with the awful tragedy, rumours began to circulate that it may not have been an accident. Morris Gilberg told a reporter that, "As some of us were robbed, I think it must have been a planned job. Several people to my knowledge had things stolen from them inside and out of the club. My brother-in-law was robbed in the street." Interestingly, this appears to have not been inquired into at the subsequent inquest, suggesting that the authorities had investigated the claim and had dismissed it as a line of inquiry. By the Wednesday morning, Princes Street was, according to Lloyd's weekly newspaper, most mournful and distressing to witness. The street was closed insofar as the general public was concerned, and the distressed people who had lost friends were the more marked by the crowds gathered at each end of the thoroughfare. In the hall itself, near the vestibule, in addition to the signs of the struggle shown in torn pieces from women's dresses, battered hats, and the broken balusters of the stairs, there was a heap of garments, said to be the property of the people who had rushed pell-mell into the street on the first cry of alarm. With the exception of the breakage of the balusters from the stairs and the breakage of the little glass office below the stairs, there is no damage to the building. Some chairs were piled on one another to admit of a gangway from the front seats or stalls, and some forms were overturned at the end near the vestibule. There was no breakage of any kind on the way out, and the whole appearance of the place gives support to the statement of the manager and others that if the crowd had been intent on going one way, the hall could have been emptied safely and quickly. On Wednesday the 19th of January, the inquest into the deaths of those who had died was opened in the theatre's main hall and was presided over by the local coroner, Win Edwin Baxter. The police were represented by Superintendent Arnold, Chief Inspector West, and Detective Inspector Aberline. Since, according to Jewish custom, the dead had to be buried before sunset on the day after death, the coroner informed the jury that their duties would be limited for that day to taking evidence of identification to enable him to give certificates for burial. They were therefore conducted to the anteroom where the bodies lay, passing on their way, so the Daily News reported, a pile of plain deal coffins ready to receive the corpses. Once the identifications had been completed, the bodies were removed for burial, and 7 of the victims were interred in the West Ham Jewish Cemetery that night. The remaining 10 bodies were taken to the houses of their relatives and were buried in the same cemetery the next day. Poignantly, the Daily News reported how, pending the removal of the bodies, women who had lost their children and men who had lost their wives were walking, weeping and lamenting through the crowd and refused to be comforted. A substantial reward was offered for information that might lead to the identification of the person who had cried "fire," but no one either came forward or was identified. When the inquest resumed at Shoreditch Town Hall on Friday the 28th of January, Inspector Aberline reported that he could not ascertain who had turned off the gas. He said he believed that this had been done for a good motive, but that, awed by the prospect of legal proceedings, the person concerned hesitated to come forward. In his summing up on the final day of the inquest, on Friday the 11th of February, Coroner Baxter was critical that, despite the fact it had been emphatically stated that the person responsible for switching off the gas had done so with the best of intentions, he was surprised that that person had not shown the moral courage to acknowledge the act. He also ruled out the suggestion that a gang had been behind the events which led to the panic. The jury returned a verdict of accidental death on each of the victims, and the inquest was concluded. For many days after the tragedy, the blinds of almost every house in Whitechapel were drawn as a mark of respect. The front of the nearby Princes Street Synagogue was draped in black crepe in mourning for the victims. David Smith and Jacob Adler were both questioned by the police, but were exonerated of any blame for the disaster. The whole thing, it was deemed, had been nothing more than a tragic accident. Later, Adler would express his sorrow for the victims and for their surviving relatives. Poor, lonely, wronged dwellers of the London ghetto. A little pleasure they had wanted, a little make-believe joy and sorrow to help them forget the bleak winter night. A little happiness, they had asked. The disaster spelt the end for his Princes Street Theatre. Gripped by superstitious horror at the tragedy that had occurred within its walls, the audiences stayed away. Even in the best days the intake had been small, Adler later recalled. Now it shrank to nothing. No play, no actor, no special announcement could bring the audience back. The theatre stayed dark and forlorn, and so empty you could hear wolves howling in the gallery. The theatre soon closed, and Adler and his troupe left London for America, where he became a major figure in the theatre scene there. His daughter Stella would become an acting coach and would teach method acting to, among others, Marlon Brando. Princelet Street, as Princes Street is known today, is a quiet Spitalfields back street where a terraced house costs just shy of £3 million. You will find nothing here that remembers that cold January night in 1887 when an audience seeking a brief escape from their toils and struggles were caught up in a tragedy that left 70 people dead and many others injured. as Israel Zangwill put it in Children of the Ghetto. He knew the wretched little hall, since tragically famous for a massacre of innocents, victims to the fatal cry of fire, more deadly than fiercest flame.